a waitress at a small-town diner, noticed a child nobody else cared about. She fed her for 8 months. Then everything changed in a single moment that would rewrite both their lives. But the truth about why it changed, the real reason behind what happened next, that's something almost nobody talks about. Because it wasn't random. It wasn't luck. It was something far more deliberate, far more calculated, and far more terrifying than anyone could have predicted. So the question that haunts this story, the question that should haunt you right now, is this: what if someone was watching you? What if, in this very moment, a stranger was observing every choice you make, every sacrifice you make when nobody's looking, judging whether you're worthy of something you can't even imagine? What if the invisible people you pass every day, the desperate ones you ignore, what if they see everything you do for them? What if they're testing you? For Claire Donovan, the morning shift at Riverside Diner in Portland, Maine was the thin line between survival and catastrophe. She was 34 years old, but her hands told a different story. They were perpetually stained with coffee grounds that no amount of scrubbing could remove completely. Her daughter Emma's asthma medication cost more than her weekly paycheck. The collection agency called every Thursday at 2:47 p.m., like clockwork, their voices mechanical and indifferent. Marcus Webb, the diner's owner, viewed his employees the way accountant views line items on a spreadsheet, as expenses to minimize, cost to reduce, numbers that needed to be smaller. He had thin lips perpetually pursed in a state of preemptive disapproval, as if the world had personally disappointed him, and he planned to return the favor to everyone around him. Claire's defining trait was simple. Kindness was all she had left to give. She skipped lunch to afford Emma's inhaler. She wore the same uniform 3 days in a row, washing it in the evenings and hoping it would dry by morning. Her car, a 2009 Honda Civic held together with prayer and duct tape, barely started on cold mornings. But it got Emma to school and Claire to work. That was enough. That had to be enough. The rent was 3 months behind. The landlord had stopped calling. That silence was worse than the threats. Tuesday morning arrived in February without fanfare. 7:23 a.m., the precise moment when the morning rush began to build. The harbor outside the diner's windows was gray and restless, the water churning with the kind of cold that made people pull their coats tighter and walk faster. That's when the little girl materialized in the corner booth, the one by the window that overlooked the water. She was 8 years old, maybe younger, with tangled dark hair that hadn't been brushed in days. Her clothes were expensive once, a cream-colored dress with delicate lace trim, a cardigan that probably cost more than Claire made in a month. But they were wrinkled and stained now, abandoned and forgotten like the child wearing them. Her patent leather Mary Janes hung above the floor without quite touching it. She stared out at the gray water with eyes that had seen too much. Ancient eyes in a child's face. Nobody else noticed her. The morning regulars, dock workers with calloused hands, fishermen who smelled of salt and diesel fuel, deliberately avoided her gaze, the way people do when they sense something broken and don't want to acknowledge it. Marcus saw only a problem, not a person. A child with no visible parent meant a customer without money. That meant a liability. Claire approached the booth with genuine warmth, the kind that came from somewhere true inside her. "Excuse me, sweetheart. Are you waiting for someone?" The child didn't respond, didn't even blink. She continued staring at the water as if Claire hadn't spoken. Claire glanced around the nearly empty diner. "Honey, where are your parents?" Still nothing. The girl's small hands were folded in her lap, still a stone. Claire's waitress instinct, the one that read people the way other people read books, told her something was desperately wrong. The child's cheeks were hollow. Her lips looked dry. When was the last time she'd eaten? Claire felt something crack open inside her chest, a door that pain tries to keep locked. She returned to the kitchen and came back with a glass of orange juice and a blueberry muffin, the kind Marcus charged $4.50 for, the kind that came out of her tips if they didn't sell. She placed them gently on the table in front of the silent child. "This is for you." The girl's eyes flickered toward the food. For just a second, a fraction of a moment, the mask cracked. Claire saw the hunger, the fear, the bone-deep loneliness that lived behind those ancient eyes. Then the wall went back up. Donovan. Marcus's voice cut across the diner like a whip crack. What are you doing? Claire felt the weight of his stare, felt it like a physical thing. She's hungry. She got money? Marcus jabbed a finger toward the booth. Get her out of here. This isn't a charity. The morning regulars looked down at their plates. Nobody wanted to be involved. Nobody wanted to risk Marcus's displeasure. Claire felt her face flush hot. $4.50. That was nearly an hour of work after taxes. That was Emma's lunch tomorrow. But she looked at the child, really looked at her, and saw something that made her chest ache. This wasn't a one-time abandonment. This had the weight of repetition, of ritual neglect, of a child who'd learned that the world wasn't interested in her survival. It comes out of my tips, Claire said quietly. She sat down across from a girl, ignoring Marcus's glare boring into her back. My name's Claire. I have a daughter about your age. Her name's Emma. She pushed the muffin closer. You don't have to talk, but you should eat. The girl stared at the muffin for what felt like an eternity. Then, with movements so careful they were almost painful to watch, she broke off a tiny piece and put it in her mouth. She took a breath, and she ate. The girl came back the next day, and the day after, and the day after that. By the third week, Claire had established a hyper-specific ritual. Always a blueberry muffin, always cut into 2 halves, never 4 quarters, always 2. Always a glass of orange juice in the clear glass, never the plastic ones. Always a glass of water in the glass with a small chip on the rim. She talked to fill the silence, the way people do when they're alone with someone who won't speak back. She told the child about Emma's school, about the drama with her classmates, about how hard it was to watch your daughter struggle and feel powerless to fix it. She talked about her dreams of opening a small bakery someday, a place where the oven would be warm and the smells would be honest, and nobody would measure your worth by how much money you had. She talked about how kindness was the only currency that actually mattered, the only thing that couldn't be devalued or lost in a stock market crash. Co-workers mocked her. Tommy, the line cook, called it wasting muffins on a street kid. Marcus deducted every muffin from her pay with visible pleasure, marking each one down in his ledger like he was collecting evidence against her. But Claire continued. Week after week, month after month, the girl began to look forward to the booth, began to eat more than just a tiny piece, began, almost imperceptibly, to exist again. She would arrive at 7:23 a.m. and wait by the window. She would eat the muffin. She would drink the juice. And she would listen while Claire talked about dreams and daughters and the strange power of showing up for someone nobody else noticed. This moment, this anchor in their chaotic lives, became sacred to them both. It was the one thing that didn't change. It was the one thing that was real. If you've ever felt like your kindness doesn't matter, like your sacrifices go unnoticed, you need to see what happens next. Most people miss the warning signs. Don't be one of them. Subscribe to find out what nobody tells you about these stories. 6 weeks of perfect routine. Then 7:23 a.m. came and went. The booth remained empty. Claire's heart sank the moment she realized it. She spent the entire shift glancing at that corner, her mind spinning with possibilities, each one worse than the last. Did something happen to her? Was she sick? Had someone finally found her and taken her away? Or worse, had she simply abandoned the diner the way everyone else had abandoned her? By evening, when Claire clocked out and walked to her car, she realized something that terrified her more than any collection agency letter ever could. She had begun to care about this child in a way that went beyond kindness, in a way that made her vulnerable, in a way that mattered. And she had nothing to offer except muffins and broken dreams. The apartment was cold when she got home. Emma was asleep on the couch, her inhaler on the coffee table. Claire sat in the dark and wondered if the girl was safe, if she was eating, if she remembered that someone cared. The next morning arrived gray and heavy. Before the diner opened, before Marcus arrived to unlock the doors, they came. 6 men, each built like a wall, each wearing tailored charcoal suits that probably cost more than Claire's monthly rent. They moved through the entrance with military precision, their movements synchronized like they'd rehearsed this moment 1,000 times. They communicated through glances and subtle hand gestures, the kind of wordless coordination that came from training and purpose. The entire diner fell silent. Even the espresso machine seemed to hold its breath. Regular customers froze mid-bite. Tommy stopped wiping down the grill. This wasn't normal. This wasn't anything close to normal. The 6 men walked directly past Marcus, past the morning regulars, straight to Claire, behind the counter. They parted slightly, creating a corridor, and through that corridor walked the 7th man. Silver-haired, probably 60 years old, with a kind of expensive watch that belonged in a museum rather than on a wrist. His suit was charcoal, immaculate, expensive in a way that made everything else in the diner look cheap. He extended his hand formally, his grip firm but controlled. "Are you Claire Marie Donovan?" Claire's mouth went dry. Her first instinct was panic. Had she done something wrong? Was this about the unpaid bills? The collection agency taking it to another level? But his expression wasn't angry. It was something else. Something official. Something final. "I'm here to inform you that Margaret Ashford passed away peacefully last night at 11:47 p.m. at her home in Cape Elizabeth." The words didn't make sense at first. Margaret Ashford. The silent child has a name. The silent child was dead. Claire's legs went weak. She grabbed the counter to steady herself. She'd never even heard that name spoken aloud. The man continued, his voice steady and practiced, as if he'd delivered this speech before. "As her attorney and executor of her estate, I've been instructed to locate you immediately. Miss Ashford left very specific instructions regarding your involvement." The diner erupted in whispers. Customers leaned toward each other, their voices urgent and confused. Marcus's face went pale, his eyes darting between Claire and the attorney, calculating what this meant for his diner. Claire couldn't breathe. The girl was gone, and somehow, impossibly, she'd left instructions. About Claire. She was quite clear in her documentation, the attorney said, pulling a thick folder from his briefcase. He opened it with deliberate slowness. "Every Tuesday and Thursday, precisely at 7:23 a.m., you bring her a blueberry muffin cut into 2 halves. Never 4 quarters. Always 2. You pour orange juice in a clear glass, never the plastic ones. You pour water in the glass with a small chip on the rim. You sit for exactly 12 minutes and speak about your dreams. About your daughter. About the bakery you wanted to open." He looked directly at Claire. His eyes held no judgment, only certainty. "You never asked for anything in return. You never mentioned payment. You simply showed up and offered kindness to a child nobody else would acknowledge." He paused, letting that sink in. She noticed everything, Miss Donovan. Every single moment. Every sacrifice. She was being observed, catalogued, and judged. And she found you worthy. Her final will and testament contains provisions that require your immediate presence at Ashford and Associates Law Office in downtown Portland, the attorney said. Behind him, one of the 6 men was already moving toward the door, preparing the way. "A car is waiting outside. Please bring only yourself." Claire looked down at her uniform, at her hands stained with coffee grounds and dishwater, at her ordinary life that was about to splinter open into something she couldn't control or understand. The attorney extended a business card, thick, cream-colored, expensive in a way that made her feel small just holding it. She left instructions about what happens next. And Miss Donovan? She was very specific about the details. If someone has been watching you for months, documenting your character when nobody else cared, what would they find? Don't wait to discover you're being judged. Subscribe now, before the moment that changes everything. The Mercedes was black and silent. The leather seats smelled like wealth and possibility, a scent Claire had never encountered before, something between expensive cologne and new car and money. The windows were tinted so darkly that the outside world became a blur, reduced to shadows and shapes. Claire sat rigid in the back seat, terrified to touch anything, afraid that her stained uniform and coffee ground-stained hands would somehow damage the perfection around her. The driver didn't speak. He was professional, invisible, the kind of person trained to exist without disturbing the air around him. through the tinted windows, the skyline of Portland rose before her. Buildings she'd never been inside, places that existed in a different world than the one she inhabited. She'd never felt more invisible and more seen simultaneously, like she was being transported between two different versions of reality. The law office occupied the top 3 floors of a glass tower downtown. Claire stepped out of the Mercedes and into a lobby that took her breath away. Marble floors, so polished they reflected the sky like water. Panoramic windows overlooking the harbor, the same harbor she saw from Riverside Diner. But from here it looked different, smaller, contained. Expensive art hung on the walls. Abstract pieces that Claire didn't understand but felt inadequate around. Paintings that probably cost more than she would earn in her entire lifetime. The attorney escorted her to an elevator made of glass and brushed steel. They rose silently. The conference room was on the 42nd floor. The attorney opened the door and gestured for her to enter. For other people sat around an obsidian table. 2 younger adults, a man and a woman, probably in their 40s, dressed in designer clothes that fit too tight around their anger. They looked like they'd been waiting for this moment and resented every second of it. An older couple sat to their left, their expressions carefully neutral. A younger man in an expensive suit sat at the far end, looking bored, checking his phone. The attorney settled into the chair at the head of the table. Before we proceed with the reading of Margaret Ashford's final testament, I want to clarify that her wishes are absolute and legally binding. There will be no challenges, no appeals, no negotiations. The woman across from Claire, Margaret's daughter, almost certainly, leaned forward with contempt etched into every line of her face. Who is this woman? Why is she here? The attorney didn't answer directly. He opened the will with deliberate precision. Margaret Ashford's estate is valued at approximately $470 million. The room tenses. Everyone straightened slightly. This wasn't theoretical anymore. This was about money. This was about inheritance. This was about who would benefit and by how much. To my son, Robert Ashford, I leave the Portland properties and the commercial real estate portfolio, valued at approximately $150 million. Robert nodded, satisfied, already calculating in his head. $150 million. That was substantial. That was life-changing. To my daughter, Victoria Ashfordson, I leave the investment accounts and the family trust, valued at approximately $180 million. Victoria's face darkened, reddened, her jaw clenching. That's all? Mother had more than. The attorney raised his hand with quiet authority. There are provisions. Both of you must maintain the charitable foundation in my name for no fewer than 10 years, or the assets revert to that foundation. Anger flashed across their faces like lightning. $150 million and $180 million, but with strings attached. With requirements. With the implication that Margaret didn't trust them to do the right thing without being forced. To Claire Marie Donovan, whom I have observed for the past 8 months, I leave the following. $500,000 to be used as she sees fit. The room went quiet. Claire felt the weight of every eye in the conference room landing on her. $500,000. That was enough to pay off every debt. That was enough to get Emma real medical care. That was enough to breathe. Additionally, the attorney continued, I leave her the old bakery on Congress Street, the one that has been closed for 3 years. Along with the property deed comes the commercial business license, the equipment, and controlling interest in the investment portfolio that funds the property. Current valuation, $18 million. The silence that followed was absolute. Robert stood abruptly. Victoria's face went white. The older couple exchanged glances. $18 million. A waitress from Riverside Diner had just inherited more than Robert's entire real estate portfolio. Claire's face went blank. She couldn't process the numbers. They were too big. They didn't fit inside her understanding of how the world worked. You're about to see why Margaret chose a waitress over her own children. But first, you need to understand what was really happening. Subscribe to see what money couldn't buy, but kindness could. Robert laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that echoed off the obsidian table. The bakery? That building hasn't been profitable in decades. What does a waitress need with a closed storefront? Some kind of charity project. His voice dripped with contempt. Victoria smirked, relieved that someone was saying what she was thinking, that this was clearly a mistake or a joke. But the attorney continued reading, his voice steady and unyielding. Included with the property deed is the commercial business license, the equipment, and controlling interest in the investment portfolio that funds the property. Current valuation, approximately $18 million. The words landed like stones in water. The room went silent. Robert's laughter died in his throat. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping backward. That's insane. That's completely insane. There has to be. Victoria's face went white, drained of all color, her smirk vanishing. Mother wouldn't. She wouldn't do this. She wouldn't. But the attorney's voice was steady, final, brooking no argument. Your mother was quite clear about this. This was intentional. Every detail was deliberate. She spent 8 months documenting her decision. This was not an impulse. This was not a mistake. The attorney walked Claire to a separate office, Margaret's private study, untouched since her death 3 days ago. Everything was arranged with precision, nothing out of place, nothing wasted. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined the walls, filled with leather-bound books that looked like they'd been read and reread, their spines cracked from use. A desk made of dark mahogany sat facing the windows overlooking Portland. On the desktop, one key sat waiting, brass, old-fashioned, purposeful. Next to it, an envelope with Claire's name written in elegant script, the handwriting careful and deliberate. She left this for you specifically, the attorney said quietly. Everything in this room. Take all the time you need. He closed the door, leaving Claire alone with the evidence of a life she never knew existed. The afternoon light filtered through the windows, casting long shadows across the carpet. Claire stood motionless for several minutes, afraid to touch anything, afraid to breathe too hard in this space that belonged to a dead woman. Claire opened the desk drawer slowly. Inside, photographs arranged chronologically, newspaper clippings about Claire's life that she'd never known anyone was collecting, financial documents detailing Margaret's observations and decisions, detailed notes written in Margaret's handwriting, page after page of observations. There was a photograph of Claire with Emma at the park, taken from a distance, professionally framed, the image sharp and clear. Claire was pushing Emma on a swing, both of them laughing at something. Next to it, a handwritten note in Margaret's careful script. She has courage. She has kindness. She has the heart I lost. There was a corkboard covered with photographs. Claire at work smiling at customers. Claire helping an elderly customer to her car on a snowy morning. Claire giving her own lunch to a homeless man outside the diner. Years of documentation. Hundreds of photographs. Years of watching. Years of testing. Margaret had followed her, documented her, analyzed her. Every act of kindness had been recorded, preserved, judged. Claire's hands trembled as she looked at the photographs. She'd never known she was being observed. She'd never known that her small, quiet choices mattered to anyone. Inside the envelope, a letter written in Margaret's careful script. Claire opened it with shaking hands and began to read. Margaret wrote about her late daughter, also named Emma, who died 15 years ago from complications of severe asthma. I became someone I didn't recognize, Margaret's words said. Someone who measured people by their net worth, who saw kindness as weakness, who built an empire to avoid feeling anything at all. I was so focused on accumulating money that I forgot why money existed in the first place, to help people, to matter. When my Emma died, I realized I'd wasted decades building something that meant nothing. Years passed. I grew older. I remained alone. Then I saw you at Riverside Diner. A woman with nothing, giving everything to a stranger. I saw my Emma's spirit reborn in your actions. I've spent the last 8 months observing whether you were worthy of carrying her legacy forward, whether you had the character my daughter had, whether you could use resources to do good instead of accumulate more. You are. You do. And I'm leaving you not just money, but purpose. Claire understood in that moment. She had never been being tested for business acumen or professional potential. She had been being tested for character. Margaret Ashford, a billionaire with the power to reshape lives, had chosen an ordinary waitress to inherit not just money, but purpose. The bakery wasn't a business investment to be optimized for profit. It was a platform, a stage for kindness, a place where the invisible could be seen. Margaret had spent 8 months watching Claire to confirm what she already suspected, that some people understood that true wealth wasn't measured in dollars. It was measured in the lives you touched, the suffering you eased, the dignity you restored to people nobody else noticed. Claire was being offered a second chance, not just for herself, but for everyone Margaret's daughter had been unable to reach. She held the letter in trembling hands and understood, finally, what it meant to be chosen. Everyone who's been invisible needs to know they matter. They need to see this. Share this with someone who's felt like nobody cared about them. Subscribe so you never miss the stories of people fighting to matter. The bank transfer took 48 hours. $500,000 appeared in Claire's account like a miracle, a number so large it seemed unreal, like the bank had made a mistake. She paid off every debt methodically, watching the collection notices disappear one by one. Medical bills vanished. Rent was paid 12 months in advance. Emma's medications were stocked for a full year. No more rationing, no more choosing between doses. For the first time in a decade, Claire breathed without panic living in her chest like a second heart. She sat on the kitchen floor of her small apartment one evening after Emma fell asleep, and she wept. Not from joy, but from the sheer weight of survival lifting. Survival had been her constant companion for so long that she'd forgotten what it felt like to live without it pressing down on her shoulders. The tears came hard and deep, years of fear and stress and impossible choices finally releasing. When she was finished, she felt hollow and clean, like something inside her had been reset. Claire returned to Riverside Diner on her last day to give notice. Marcus was behind the counter, totaling receipts in his ledger, his perpetually pursed lips looking even more disapproving than usual. She found him in the back office. "I'm giving my 2 weeks' notice," she said simply. Marcus barely looked up from his ledger. "Fine. I'll find another waitress. There's always someone desperate enough to work for minimum wage." He didn't ask where she was going, didn't ask what she'd do next. She was already erased from his mind, already replaced by the next problem to solve. But the regulars, the fishermen and dock workers who'd watched her feed a silent child week after week, who'd seen her sacrifice her own lunch, who'd witnessed her kindness under pressure, they gnawed with something like respect as she walked out. One old man, weathered and gray, put a hand on her shoulder. "You did good, Claire. Real good." Walking out of Riverside Diner for the last time, she realized she'd been living a half-life, going through motions, surviving rather than existing. Now she got to actually live. The bakery on Congress Street was beautiful and broken in equal measure. Stainless steel ovens gathered dust behind papered-over windows. The front counter was empty, the display cases bare. But Claire saw potential in the emptiness, not as a profit center or a business opportunity, but as a sanctuary, a space waiting to be filled with purpose. She spent 2 weeks cleaning obsessively, dreaming about what this place could become, planning every detail. She discovered Margaret's hidden investment portfolio, diversified stocks managed by professionals, real estate holdings throughout Portland, a small publishing company that focused on social impact. $18 million of carefully managed wealth, waiting to be deployed with intention. The bakery wasn't just a property. It was an engine for good, if she had the courage to use it that way. She hired a business manager named Patricia, who specialized in social enterprises, nonprofits and mission-driven organizations that prioritized people over profit. Patricia was sharp, experienced, and skeptical at first. "Why are you really doing this?" she asked during their first meeting. Together, they created a new model, a bakery where the homeless could eat free, where foster children received vocational training in baking and business management, where kindness wasn't just practiced, but was the entire point of the operation. Patricia challenged her frequently. "Are you sure? You could sell this, take the money, retire." You've earned it. Claire looked at the empty bakery, at the space waiting to be filled. No, she said quietly. I'm going to fill it with people Margaret wanted to see. People nobody else sees. 3 months in, a crisis emerged. The building's structural integrity was questioned during a routine inspection. A crack in the foundation, deep and spreading. The inspector's report was grim. This could cost $50,000 to fix. Maybe more. You might need to close temporarily. Claire called Patricia in panic. What do I do? I can't. Patricia looked at her calmly. You're not a restaurant owner, Claire. You're a steward. You use your resources to solve the problem. Claire accessed the maintenance fund from Margaret's portfolio. Hired contractors. The bakery stayed open, serving hot bread to people who'd forgotten what kindness tastes like. The crack was fixed. The operation continued. In that moment, Claire understood that she wasn't just running a business. She was fulfilling a legacy. She was becoming what Margaret had seen in her 8 months ago. Someone worthy of the responsibility to change lives. Your moment is coming too. The moment when someone will watch you and decide if you're worthy. Don't let that moment catch you unprepared. Subscribe now and learn what Margaret knew about character. Robert Ashford hired aggressive lawyers within 48 hours. The kind of lawyers who specialized in dismantling wills, who saw inheritance disputes as puzzles to solve through relentless pressure and tactical aggression. He contested the will immediately. His legal team claimed Margaret was mentally unstable in her final months. Claimed undue influence. Claimed manipulation. A waitress couldn't possibly be the intended beneficiary of $18 million. Someone convinced her. Someone manipulated a vulnerable, aging woman into making decisions that contradict decades of family expectations. The legal battle became public almost overnight. News outlets descended like vultures, hungry for the story. Newspapers ran headlines: Billionaire's secret heir, waitress or con artist. Local television stations broadcasted images of Claire outside the courthouse. Her face was in papers alongside photographs of Robert looking concerned and betrayed. People she knew from Riverside Diner called to ask if she'd stolen from a dead woman. Former co-workers left messages asking if she'd manipulated an elderly lady. The pressure was suffocating. It pressed down on her chest until she couldn't breathe. Every news cycle brought new accusations. Every interview with Robert's lawyers painted her as a predator who'd targeted a vulnerable billionaire. The narrative was being written by people with resources and connections. Claire was just a waitress trying to survive. Patricia met with Claire in the office above the bakery, her expression serious and focused. They have expensive lawyers. They have family name recognition. They have money and media connections. But you have something they don't. What? Claire asked, her voice hollow. The truth. And Margaret's words. Patricia pulled out the sealed letters Margaret had left, dozens of them, each one detailing her observations, her reasoning, her absolute certainty that Claire was the right person. Envelopes filled with Margaret's handwriting, with photographs, with documentation spanning 8 months. We don't fight this in court using their weapons, Patricia said. We fight this in public. We let Margaret speak for herself. The hearing took place in Portland's courthouse on a cold March morning. Media cameras lined the steps outside, reporters shouting questions at anyone who approached. Robert's lawyer was first to present his case. He argued that Margaret was vulnerable, isolated, manipulated by a scheming waitress who'd recognized opportunity and exploited it ruthlessly. He presented expert testimony suggesting cognitive decline in Margaret's final months. Psychologists testified about susceptibility to undue influence in elderly patients. Claire was painted as a predator, a gold digger, someone who deliberately targeted a lonely billionaire and extracted millions through emotional manipulation. Then Claire took the stand. She didn't deny anything. She told the story simply, without embellishment or drama. The blueberry muffins. The silence of a child nobody else would feed. The 12 minutes of conversation every morning. The dreams she shared about opening a bakery, about giving Emma a better life. She described Margaret's final letter in detail, the part where Margaret wrote, I spent 72 years becoming someone I wasn't. In watching Claire, I saw who I should have been all along. Her voice never wavered. Her hands didn't shake. She simply told the truth. Patricia presented Margaret's meticulous records to the court. Thousands of photographs taken over 8 months. Detailed notes spanning every day Claire and Margaret had shared. Financial documentation showing Margaret's deliberate investment in the bakery property years before she'd ever seen Claire. She wasn't impulsive, Patricia explained to the court. She was methodical. She tested Claire's character under extreme circumstances and found her worthy. The photographs told the story in sequence. Claire giving her own lunch to homeless people on the street. Claire helping elderly customers to their cars on snowy mornings. Claire refusing tips from a man who made inappropriate advances. Year after year of the same pattern. Kindness offered without expectation of reward. Sacrifice made without announcement. But the real blow came when Margaret's personal therapist took a stand. Margaret Ashford came to see me 3 months before she died. I had been her therapist for 15 years. She was the most mentally sound, most intentional person I've ever worked with. She told me she was going to give the majority of her wealth to people she'd observed living lives of quiet virtue. She wasn't seeking redemption for herself. She was seeking to create a different legacy, one based on character, not accumulation. The therapist looked directly at the judge. Margaret Ashford knew exactly what she was doing. She'd spent decades building wealth. She spent her final months intentionally redirecting that wealth toward people who demonstrated the character traits that money couldn't buy. That's not the action of someone mentally unstable. That's the action of someone finally becoming who she always wanted to be. People are watching how you treat the invisible. Don't let them see you turn away. Like this video if you'd feed the stranger nobody else notices. Comment what you'd do in Claire's shoes. And subscribe so you never miss the moment someone's watching you. The judge ruled in Claire's favor, not just on the validity of the will, but on Robert's attempts to contest it. His voice was steady and definitive as he read from the bench. The evidence shows no undue influence, no cognitive impairment, and no fraud. Margaret Ashford's intentions were clearly documented and legally sound. This court finds no basis for contesting her final wishes. Robert's face went rigid, his jaw clenching, his eyes flashing with the kind of anger that comes from losing something you believed was yours by right. Victoria stood abruptly and stormed out of the courtroom, her expensive heels clicking against the marble floor like a countdown. The media erupted outside, reporters shouting questions, cameras flashing. But Claire felt only a strange sadness as she walked out of the courthouse. Sadness for people so consumed by greed that they couldn't see what Margaret had actually been offering. Redemption. A chance to become something other than what money had made them. An opportunity to matter in a different way. The bakery reopened 6 months later, transformed but recognizable. The crack in the foundation was repaired by skilled contractors. The stainless steel ovens were cleaned and polished until they shined. The front windows displayed bread and pastries and possibility. Sourdough loaves with golden crusts, cinnamon rolls that filled the street with their smell, cookies decorated with care. But the most important thing wasn't visible in photographs. Claire had created a training program for foster youth, teenagers who'd aged out of the system with no family and no direction. She hired people nobody else would hire. Individuals with criminal records who'd paid their debt to society. Homeless people trying to rebuild their lives. People society had written off as failures. She paid fair wages, provided benefits, treated everyone as human beings rather than transactions. The bakery became famous not for its bread, though the bread was exceptional. It became famous for its heart. News outlets began covering the transformation. Local influencers started visiting. People traveled from across Maine to buy bread from the place where a waitress had turned kindness into legacy. Claire finally opened the small bakery cafe she'd dreamed about on those Tuesdays at Riverside Diner while feeding a silent child. It was called Emma's Kitchen, named for both Margaret's lost daughter and her own. The space was warm, welcoming, designed to feel like home for people who'd never had one. Emma, now 14 years old, worked alongside her mother during weekends and summers. Her asthma was managed properly, regularly, without the constant fear of cost. Emma's future was possible in a way it had never been before. She talked about college, about becoming a teacher, about building a life that went beyond mere survival. Claire had balanced the old life and the new, still working with her hands, still talking to customers, still believing that kindness was the highest currency, but now with resources to amplify that belief infinitely. She hadn't forgotten where she came from. She'd simply been given the power to help others escape that place. The narrator returned to the opening question, transformed by everything that had followed. We watched Claire Donovan discover that the greatest investments we can make are not in material things, but in each other. A simple act of kindness, offered to someone who seemed to have nothing, rippled outward in ways neither Claire nor Margaret could have predicted. But the real question isn't about Claire. It's about you. Right now, in your own life. Who are the silent people you're ignoring? And do you have the grace to notice them? Because someone is watching. Someone always is. And the question isn't whether you'll get rewarded. The question is whether you can live with yourself if you don't try. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the invisible people in your life, please like this video. Comment below. Would you have done the same? Tell me honestly, would you have fed that child when nobody was watching? Would you have sacrificed when the sacrifice was invisible? Subscribe for more stories about ordinary people who lived extraordinary lives through simple acts of kindness. People just like you who discovered their character was worth more than they ever imagined. And share this with someone who needs to remember that their life matters, that their choices matter, that they are being watched, not by mysterious billionaires, but by a world that desperately needs more people like Claire Donovan. More people who believe kindness is worth the cost. More people brave enough to notice the invisible. The world is full of silent children waiting to be seen. Will you be someone who sees them